Good morning. Welcome to the boardroom of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm Robert Sumwalt, and I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the NTSB. Joining me today are my colleagues on the board, Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg and Member Jennifer Homendy. Today, we meet in open session as required by the government and the Sunshine Act to consider the head-on collision of an Amtrak passenger train with a stationary CSX freight train in Cayce, South Carolina on February the 4th, 2018. The Amtrak train carrying 141 passengers and 8 crew members was diverted from a main track onto an auxiliary track through a reversed hand-throw switch. That is, the main track was aligned so that the train would operate onto the auxiliary track where a CSX train was standing, rather than continuing straight on the mainline track as was supposed to happen. The Amtrak train went into emergency braking. Its speed decreased from 57 miles per hour to a last recorded speed of 53 miles per hour. The Amtrak collided head-on with the CSX train at about 2:27 in the morning. And tragically, the conductor and engineer of the Amtrak train lost their lives. And to the families and friends of that Amtrak crew, we want to express our sincerest condolences for their loss. But there were 92 people that were transported to hospitals, and we hope that they are on their way to a successful recovery as well. Understand, please, that our purpose for being here is to prevent the same sort of accident from happening again, and that's why we are here. There's so many details, important details to this accident, but the heart of it is very simple. The switch was left so that any train coming down the main track would strike a standing train. Year in and year out, improperly lined switches lead to a steady progression of accidents. As a quick snapshot, between 2013 and 2017, improperly lined switches led to accidents that took the life of one person and injured 65 others. And if we go back further, the NTSB has been investigating and making recommendations to prevent misaligned switch accidents for more than 4 decades. Yet, the risk persists to this day unmitigated. This is despite a history of recommendations on the part of this board, including urgent recommendations made last year as a result of this accident. In the wake of a 2005 switching accident in Graniteville, South Carolina, just about 60 miles away from where this Cayce accident occurred, the Federal Railroad Administration issued an emergency order calling for more training about switching errors and provided fines to punish such errors. Part of the documentation for that order was for a switch position awareness form, or SPAF, which CSX required the crew in Cayce to complete when realigning switches in dark territory. The NTSB did not believe that calling for more training or swifter punishment would eliminate the type of error we saw in Graniteville, and we favored more tangible mitigation, such as, quote, the development of an automatically activated device independent of the switch banner that will visually or electronically compellingly capture the attention of employees involved with switch operations and clearly convey the status of the switch both in daylight and in darkness, end of quote. Also in response to the Graniteville accident, we asked the FRA to require that in dark territory, in the absence of automatic switch position indicators, railroads operate their trains at speeds that would allow them to be safely stopped in advance of misaligned switches. Last year, in response to an accident in Roswell, New Mexico, we recommended that the FRA require railroads to develop a device or technique to eliminate the possibility of employees failing to perform critical tasks, such as lining a switch, lining a derail, or ensuring cars are in the clear. Now, in response to the Cayce accident, we issued an urgent recommendation that the FRA require that when signal suspensions are in effect and a switch has been reported to be relined for a main track, the next train or locomotive to pass that location must approach the switch at a restricted speed and report the switch position to the dispatcher. But instead of requiring this, the FRA proposed recommending that railroads adhere to industry best safety practices. And today, staff will propose that the board close this recommendation in an unacceptable classification because the FRA did not do what we asked them to do. Last July, the NTSB convened an investigative hearing entitled Passenger Safety on Passenger Railroads. And one critical focus was the relationship between Amtrak and a host railroad, which are governed by host railroad agreements. In this case at Cayce, Amtrak trains were required to comply with CSX rules rather than Amtrak rules. As we will discuss today, this had the potential to create a lower level of safety for Amtrak passengers and crew when operating during signal suspension. Now, for today's board meeting, staff have pursued all avenues to propose findings, a probable cause, and recommendations. They will lay out the accident, the facts, circumstances, and conditions. They will lay that out in presentations this morning. Then after staff's presentations, the board will pose questions to the investigative staff. We will then vote on, deliberate any proposed amendments, and then we plan to adopt a vote on the findings, the probable cause, the recommendations, and then the entire report. The public docket for this accident is available from both this accident and the public hearing, the investigative hearing that was conducted last year. It's available at ntsb.gov. That docket contains literally thousands of pages of information, including photographs, post-accident interviews, exhibits from the hearing, group chairman's factual reports, emergency response records, and host railroad agreements between CSX and Amtrak. Once finalized, in about 30 days, the final report that we adopt today will also be posted on the NTSB's webpage. Now, Deputy Managing Director Paul Sledzik, if you'll kindly introduce the staff, and good morning.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Good morning. A few safety announcements before we begin. First, I kindly request that if you've not done so already, please silence your mobile phones and other electronic devices. There are two exits from the boardroom. Here at the front of the auditorium, on either side of the dais, you'll see exit signs below the projection screens. There are a set of stairs below each of those, so walk down those stairs, exit out the doors at the bottom of the stairwell. That will take you into the lower part of the office building, and you'll exit the building through those hallways. The other exit are the doors that you entered this facility in, so please walk up the aisle, out through the glass doors, out through the doors at the top of the stairs, and then go left to proceed away from the building. NTSB staff and security personnel will direct you in case of an event of an emergency, and will also direct you when it's safe to come back into the building. There is also an AED device located in the lobby of the boardroom, and the security personnel can contact 911 if needed. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact any NTSB staff person. Seated at the panel this morning, unless otherwise noted, are staff members of the Office of Rail, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Investigations. On the first row, starting to my right, is Robert Hall, Director of that office. To his right is Dave Bucher, Chief of the Railroad Division. To his right is Dick Hipskind, who's the investigator in charge for this accident. To his right is Tomas Torres, who looked at operations during this accident. And to his right is Dr. Michael Heff, who's the Human Performance and Safety Systems Investigator for this accident. Behind Dr. Heff is Ruben Payan, who has studied signals and train control for this accident. To his left is Dr. Robert Beaton, Chief of the System Safety Division. To his left is Dr. Mary Pat McKay, the Chief Medical Officer in the Office of Research and Engineering. To Dr. McKay's left is Jim Ritter, the Director of the Office of Research and Engineering. To his left is Stephanie Masker, who is sitting in briefly this morning for Kathy Silbaugh, who is our General Counsel. Kathy is stuck in traffic, unfortunately, this morning. And to Stephanie's left is Darlene Hatchett, Director of the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Behind Ms. Hatchett is Troy Lloyd from Rail, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials, who is handling visuals and the timer this morning. To his right is Pam Oleski, the writer-editor for this report. To her right is Michael Hamilton, the rail specialist in the Safety Recommendations Division and the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. To Michael's right is Dana Sanzo, the Deputy Chief in the Rail Division. To Dana's right is Joe Gordon, who analyzed track and engineering for this accident. And to Mr. Gordon's right is Mike Hiller, who looked at the mechanical aspects of this accident. The presentations this morning will begin with an overview of the accident by the investigator in charge, Dick Hipskind.
Good morning, Chairman Sumwalt, Vice Chairman Landsberg, Member Homendy. On February 4th, 2018, about 2:27 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, southbound Amtrak Train 91, operating within the limits of a signal suspension on a track warrant, was diverted from the main track through a reversed hand-thrown switch into the silica storage track and collided head-on with a stationary CSX freight train. The accident occurred on CSX's Columbia subdivision in Cayce, South Carolina. This is an aerial view of the collision. The Amtrak train was going about 50 miles an hour on impact and traveled about 660 feet from the switch located in the lower right corner, as marked by the yellow triangle, to the point of collision as marked by the yellow star. The collision of the locomotives are in the upper right-hand corner of this photo. Damages were $25.4 million. Prior to the collision, the crew of the F777 went on duty at Cayce Yard at 3:30 p.m., and they were assigned to bring a train into the Cayce Yard that had been allowed to enter the signal suspension before stopping at 12:15 p.m. due to the hours of service regulations. After completing that task, the F777 crew was instructed to place loaded auto rack cars into the auto ramp facility and place the empty cars into the silica storage track nearby. The auto ramp facility is shown here on the right, and the silica storage track is shown on the left. They were in this vicinity for about 5.5 hours before clearing up in the storage track about 1:50 a.m. The crew was aware of the Amtrak train's schedule, and so they had completed their assigned work about 36 minutes prior to the arrival of the Amtrak train at the north switch of the silica storage track. As a result of the collision, the 2 Amtrak crew members on the lead locomotive died. 92 persons, passengers and crew, were transported to local hospitals. 74 of the 92 were confirmed injured. 9 were coded as serious. On February 15, 2018, NTSB issued an urgent safety recommendation to the FRA to issue an emergency order regulating train operations during signal suspensions. FRA did not issue an emergency order for signal suspensions, but they did issue a safety advisory on November 29, 2018. On March 4th, 2018, Amtrak revised its operating procedures on all host railroads during signal suspensions. On March 7, 2018, CSX changed its signal suspension planning, operating procedures, and rules to reduce the risk of a misaligned switch. This is the on-scene investigative team. Chairman Sumwalt was on scene. And these are the personnel of NTSB supporting this investigation. Parties to this investigation were Federal Railroad Administration, State of South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff, National Railroad Passenger Corporation, or Amtrak, CSX Transportation, Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers, and the Brotherhood of Railroad Signalmen. Issues in this report will cover operations during signal suspensions, the actions and responsibilities of the train crew handling switches, CSX efficiency testing programs and staffing, implementation of a safety management system by Amtrak to assess and mitigate risk for operations on host railroads, occupant protection in passenger rail cars, and finally, the medical examination for railroad employees. This completes my presentation this morning. We have prepared presentations on signals, operations, human performance, and system safety. We will begin with Mr. Payan for signals.
Good morning. This presentation will discuss the temporary suspension of the signal and train control system that was in place at the time of the accident. CSX was working to meet the mandate that requires positive train control systems to be operational on certain main tracks of their system. The Columbia subdivision was in the process of implementing PTC. To accomplish this, CSX divided the Columbia subdivision into 8 track segments to complete PTC implementation. Segments 1 through 6 had been previously completed. Track segment 7, the accident segment, was in progress when the collision occurred. The work on track segment 7 affected more than 20 miles of main track on the Columbia subdivision. During segment 7, CSX signal personnel were scheduled to install electronic track circuits and communication circuits, upgrade Vital Logic controllers so they would be PTC compatible, and replace and relocate wayside signals. So CSX suspended the signal system in this area to complete the planned upgrades. The signal suspension became effective on Saturday, February 3rd, 2018 at 8 a.m. as specified by a CSX Columbia Subdivision bulletin order. CSX train dispatchers placed the signals between CP Holdout and CP Northeast Woodford in signal suspend mode. Train movements were controlled by track warrants, transmitted by radio, and recorded by train crews on paper form. During post-accident interviews, CSX signal personnel stated the signal suspension was scheduled for 2 days, but they were trying to complete the work in 1.5 days. The Columbia Subdivision Bulletin would remain in effect until the signal modifications were completed, and a new bulletin was issued to cancel the signal suspension. During the signal upgrade, trains entered the limits of the temporary signal suspension 3 times, while CSX personnel were completing the signal cutover. During post-accident interviews, CSX signal personnel estimated that train movements totaled about 6 hours inside the temporary signal suspension limits and caused a delay in completion of the signal upgrades. This was because some signal tests could not be performed with rail equipment occupying the track circuits. The CSX modifications to the signal system required FRA approval. CSX had previously petitioned and was granted approval for the signal modifications that were planned for the Columbia subdivision. FRA, however, does not require approval of temporary signal suspensions needed to perform required maintenance or repairs. But federal regulations do require railroads to provide for the safety of train operations before interfering with the normal functioning of any signal device. Federal regulations allow railroads to decide on the alternate method of operations to implement during temporary signal suspensions if railroads elect to continue operating trains through a signal suspension. Thank you. That concludes my presentation. Mr. Torres will now discuss railroad operations.
Good morning. My presentation will look at 4 factors: the signal suspension, the involved train crews, the switch position, job briefing, operational testing. A signal suspension changes the environment in which the train crews operate. The expectation was for the CSX train crew to adapt to the changed environment. When a signal system is operational, the dispatcher controls the lining of switches and signals for train operations. During a signal suspension, the signal system is not operational. Trains are governed by track warrants from the train dispatcher, and non-signal territory operational rules apply. Some train crews may not have applied these rules for an extended period. In signal suspensions, communication between the train crews and the train dispatcher is critical. Information about the switch alignment, signal indication, and track occupancy are not available to the train dispatcher. An EC1 is a form that is used by the train crew to record the train dispatcher's instructions, such as the limits of the train's authority and the use of main track switches. The crew is required to execute the train dispatcher's instructions. The investigation showed that there was an added layer of risk when CSX allowed switching operations in a changed operational environment. The CSX engineer and conductor were jointly responsible for the position of the main track switch, line for main track, as required by CSX and FRA rules. The locomotive engineer and conductor were experienced, certified, and qualified to perform their duties. Amtrak crew was fully qualified on both Amtrak and CSX operating rules. The Amtrak train crew was also fully familiar with the territory and was up to date on the required training and territory qualifications. The CSX crew was responsible to ensure that the main track switch was properly lined prior to releasing the track authority. The CSX crew was also required to maintain a switch position awareness form called a SPAF. The information on the SPAF is required to be reported to the train dispatcher. The information recorded on a SPAF includes the name of the employee who operated the switch and the location and time the switches were operated. NTSB investigators did not find the SPAF. In NTSB interviews, the crew said that they did not accurately complete the form. Prior to the release of the train crew's EC1 authority, the conductor was asked by the train dispatcher if the switches were lined for the main track. The conductor reported that all switches were lined for the main track. After the authority was released, the engineer asked the conductor if the switch had properly been lined back for the main track movement. The engineer and conductor discussed the position of the main track switch, but disagreed on the position. They did not verify the position of the switch. Staff has proposed recommendations to address this issue. There was limited oversight and physical presence of local management and an exclusive reliance on operating rules to address safety concerns. Neither the CSX conductor nor the engineer were tested for operation of main track switches, job briefing regarding position of main track switches, EC1 authority, and switch position awareness form. These efficiency tests were insufficient. Over a 60-day period, CSX officers conducted increased operational tests. The CSX officers tested for rules pertaining to restoring hand-operated switches on controlled track to normal position, verbally confirming the position of the switches in locked, EC1 instructions, and the SPAF. On March 7th, 2018, CSX issued a bulletin pertaining to hand-operated main track switches. If any crew member has doubt or uncertainty about the position of the switch, the authority must not be released. The CSX Signal Department issued a signal suspension operating plan. The new instructions cover job briefings, oversight, adequate staffing, Operations Center, and train crew responsibilities and communication. In addition to existing rules governing the use of hand-operated switches, the plan incorporates the best practices outlined in an FRA safety advisory and provides redundant verification of switch position. If switches are required to be operated for train movement, the signal department will verify that the switch is properly lined and secure the switch with a craft-specific lock, red tag before the train movement. After the train movement is made, the switch will be restored by the train crew or switch stander and secured by the signal department. Transportation supervisors will monitor train activity within limits of the signal suspension and include operational testing. This completes my presentation. Dr. Haff will discuss human performance and system safety.
Good morning. Good morning. My presentation will discuss manually operated switches and safety management on host railroads. As discussed by Mr. Torres, the CSX conductor failed to realign a switch, an error of omission. Omissions are more likely to occur when steps are repeated, located near the end of a task sequence, lacking in conspicuity, and require alternative operating procedures. These factors were applicable to the step of realigning the switch. The locomotive crew made approximately 120 forward and backward movements during the shift, which required the conductor to repeatedly operate switches. Moreover, the accident occurred at the end of the shift at about 2:27 a.m. It was dark and there were no lights at the switch. Finally, due to the signal suspension, alternative operating procedures were used, which the conductor had less experience with. The NTSB has been concerned about misaligned switches since at least 1974 when it investigated a fatal accident in Cotulla, Texas, involving a misaligned switch in non-signal territory. The accident in Cayce is the latest in a history of misaligned switch accidents. Several of these are listed here, though this list is not comprehensive. Though the characteristics of each accident varied, they involved a human failing to properly line a switch. The NTSB has made recommendations to the FRA to prevent misaligned switch accidents. Central to these recommendations are attempts to manage human errors that cause misaligned switches. However, the FRA relies on administrative controls. Such controls amount to rule changes and require error-free human performance to be effective. Unless the FRA develops a regulatory requirements for more robust controls, misaligned switch accidents will continue to occur. The FRA insists that the NTSB's recommendations would be too costly, while its own database shows that improperly lined switches have been a leading cause of accidents and incidents for years. Staff proposes recommendation reiterations in this area. Most NTSB investigations of Amtrak accidents have been off-property, that is, on tracks owned by other railroads. Recently, Amtrak has had accidents in Vermont, Kansas, and Washington. The current accident occurred in South Carolina. The close timing of the DuPont, Washington, and Cayce, South Carolina accidents prompted the NTSB to hold a 2-day investigative hearing. After completing the DuPont investigation, the NTSB determined that Amtrak's efforts to manage safety off-property were deficient and made several recommendations. Reliance on host railroads is a central feature of Amtrak's business model. 97% of the nearly 21,000 route miles Amtrak operates are owned by other railroads and subject to host agreements. The host railroad agreement between Amtrak and CSX requires that Amtrak shall be governed by and subject to all then current operating and safety rules, orders, procedures, and standards of CSX. This is consistent with Amtrak's System Safety Program Plan, which indicates that when Amtrak crews operate trains off property, they follow the operating rules of the host. At the time of the accident, Amtrak did not have a strategy for managing safety off-property beyond the selection of operating rules. The selection of a rulebook does not constitute a safety management system. Moreover, Amtrak followed the operating rulebook of each host railroad without conducting any risk assessments. The result was that Amtrak crews and passengers were exposed to varying levels of risk depending on location. After the accident, Amtrak senior officials questioned their policy of following the rules of the host railroad without first conducting risk assessments. They recognized that Amtrak would not have routed the train on Amtrak property over a facing point switch at full track speed with the signal suspended. However, this practice was followed on CSX track, and thus, as per Amtrak policy at the time, the Amtrak crew followed CSX rules. Amtrak accepted a higher level of risk off property than would have accepted on its own property. Several Amtrak senior officials told investigators that since the accident, new processes to manage risk for trains operating off property have been implemented. Further, these officials stated that Amtrak is working to improve safety culture, which was identified as a concern after a fatal Amtrak accident in Chester, Pennsylvania in 2016. This graphic shows Amtrak track, including track that they lease. Amtrak owns and maintains track on the Northeast Corridor, which has 457 mainline miles, as well as 97 miles between Porter, Indiana, and Kalamazoo, Michigan. This graphic shows all the track that Amtrak operates over, most of which is owned by other railroads. Moving forward, Amtrak's success in managing safety off property will be contingent on receiving cooperation from host railroads. Amtrak operates passenger trains, often at higher speeds than freight trains. Amtrak must manage different risks than freight railroads. Even other passenger railroads that Amtrak must interact with present risk management challenges. It is imperative that all host railroads understand Amtrak's critical need to manage safety off property and fully cooperate to minimize risk for passenger trains. Without full participation from host railroads, Amtrak efforts to improve safety off property will not be effective. Staff proposes a recommendation to the host railroads regarding this issue. To mitigate the possibility of a crew member misaligning a switch, a well-documented risk, CSX largely relied on the accurate completion of the switch position awareness form. On the day of the accident, the crew failed to do so. This has occurred many times in the past, and thus, the switch position awareness form has proven to be a weak administrative control. An organization with effective risk management processes would have identified that stronger controls that do not require error-free human performance were needed. And using a weak administrative control for a known risk, CSX demonstrated insufficient risk management. CSX needs a comprehensive system that evaluates all risks, including but not limited to operations, training, maintenance, equipment, and medical fitness for duty. Safety management systems have proven highly effective in improving safety. Staff proposes a recommendation to CSX to develop and implement a safety management system. NTSB system safety interoperability concerns extend not just to Amtrak and its host railroads, but to the entire rail industry. Without comprehensive requirements for risk management and other critical safety processes, gaps will continue to exist in the industry. On August 12, 2016, the Federal Railroad Administration published a final rule requiring each commuter and intercity passenger railroad to develop and implement a system safety program. This regulation would improve passenger safety by advancing system safety standards in the industry. However, the FRA has repeatedly delayed the implementation of this regulation over the course of several years. On June 12, 2019, the FRA announced its 7th postponement, and today the regulation remains to be enacted. After the Chester accident in 2017, the NTSB recommended that the FRA enact the regulation without further delay. This recommendation was reiterated after the Amtrak DuPont accident. The findings from the current investigation lead staff to propose another reiteration. This concludes the staff presentations. Staff will be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much for those presentations, and thank you for a very good investigation. We will begin with board member questions, and Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When a signal suspension goes into effect, and I think you've described this a little bit, but does this provide or create an extra burden on dispatchers, conductors, and engineers?
Yeah, well, when it goes to a non-signal operation, then it's considered manual operation. So a lot of it is now verbal, and a lot of the instructions are written. So the train dispatcher has to keep a log of who he authorized into those limits. And the information that he uses is from the train crew. So the train crew needs to report accurate information as to the train's location and the position of the switch.
So the system in this degraded capability is not fully automated, is that correct?
That's correct.
So we really are depending upon personnel to perform at a higher level. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Is there a difference between signal suspension and non-signal territory? I noticed those two in the report.
Well, when the signal's suspended, within those limits from A to B, that becomes non-signal territory. Because now the signals are not operating as they should. You know, the signal system's designed to space out trains, you know, for following movements or opposing movements. When a signal system is operational, a train enters those limits, if there's a following movement, then it'll start to get signal indications like flashing yellow, yellow. You know, that's to space out the trains. But on a non-signal territory, you don't have any of that. So when a train is authorized into those limits, if they authorize a second following movement in there, then that second movement has to operate at restricted speed.
Is there a system of checks and balances that exists with or did that exist at the time of the Cayce accident? Pretty much things are being done by radio or telephone, is that correct?
Correct.
So is there a system by which somebody can say, yes, I did this, and there's, you know, a demand response type of system to verify that?
Yeah, they call it a mandatory directive. You know, that's the method that's employed in a non-signal territory. And that's when verbal authorities, you know, come into play.
So during the investigative hearing, CSX provided NTSB with some history on signal cutover operations, which was what was going on here to prepare for positive train control. Approximately how many of those were conducted over the last 10 years as PTC was being implemented?
Oh, there it is. We didn't get 10 years of history. At the public hearing, at the investigative hearing, the signal service test engineer testified that he had been working and had been doing about 10 signal suspensions per year since 2014. That was basically when the PTC implementation started picking up. And in 2018, the one where the accident happened was his third one for that year.
In the information that I got, there was, I think it dated back to about 2008, which would give us, this was a public submission, would give us just about 10 years. The number that CSX showed was approximately 900. Does that jive with your information?
I was going by the testimony, not the submission. But
Okay,
yes, that sounds
all right,
correct.
that was a submission. This was managed successfully 900 times prior to Cayce. Why did it fail this time?
I don't know the particulars of the other 900, but it all depends on the territory. If it's double track during suspensions, they can single track. Sometimes there's less train traffic or other methods. But the way they suspended signals was pretty much the same method they used throughout their system. Well, why that failed this time? That'd be more human factors or operations. Signals were taken out and alternate methods were implemented to operate trains. And that alternate method, something in that method failed.
Okay, I'll pursue this a little bit more, Mr. Chairman. My time is up here.
Thank you very much. Hearing some kind of noise out there in the hallway, so I'm not.
Yes, sir, the fire alarm is going off in the lower part of the building, but it has not gone off here, so we're fine right now. Apologize for the background noise there.
Thank you. And our fire expert will tell us that fire rises. Okay, good. No, I did hear that noise, and thanks for being on top of that. Member Hamady.
Thank you. Dr. Hoff, you mentioned procedures for signal suspensions rely on error-free human performance to be effective. Can you, in 1 minute or less, talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so the procedures in place required that the crew accurately complete the switch position awareness form and accurately rely on the switch. And the idea is that there's a communication that happens between the engineer, the conductor, and the dispatcher. And between the three of them, they're going to ensure that that switch gets aligned properly. And most of the time, as in the previous 900 times that, this was done, that goes just fine. But ultimately, it is reliant on humans. This is what we would call administrative controls, how work is done, as opposed to if you were going to go up the hierarchy of controls, you would go to engineering controls, which would be something that would be a harder control, something computer controlled and less susceptible to human error.
Thank you. And our report states that in addition, a review of the CSX train dispatcher instructions allowed for an additional crew member, a switch tender, to be assigned. Why did CSX management make the decision to not add the switch tender to the job?
During the interviews, we did ask that question, and they said that they made the decision based on train traffic and the operation. That's based on the manager that's in charge of that territory. He made the decision that switch tenders were not necessary.
But that would have provided some redundancy, correct?
Well, the switch tenders are for powered switches, which is the ones that, when the system is operational, the train dispatcher controls. In this case, the switch that was involved, even though it was a main track switch, it's a manual operated switch. So on their packet, they have instructions for the train dispatcher and for the train crews that all power switches will be taken off of power and secured for main track movement. So to stop and inspect those switches was not necessary. What CSX did not do was mitigate the risk involved with that manually operated switch.
Correct.
That's where.
Well, and that leads me to my next question. Did you all look at what other railroads do during signal suspension? And what did you find?
Yes, other railroads, what they do is they lock and clamp their, or spike their switches. And they don't have any switching operations. It's just through traffic. And they limit the type of traffic. For example, any manifest trains are secured at the terminals, and they only operate intermodal expedited trains. So they try to reduce the number of trains, but there's no work involved.
And some railroads, like Norfolk Southern, will do a shorter amount of time for that specific work involved, correct?
Correct.
Right. So we had 23 miles that were under suspension, a totally different operating environment than the crew or those operating in that territory are used to, on a weekend, and work wasn't completed, so they left the signal suspension in place, correct? And then and I'm doing this more for people who are here or watching, and all movements in that territory were now governed by verbal communication or track warrant, correct?
Correct.
So did CSX make changes after the accident? And what kind of safety measures were put in place after the accident?
Well, what they're doing now during a signal suspension or when they're operating a hand-operated switch, now a crew member has to remain at the switch when the authority is being released to verify the position of the switch, and all crew members must verify the position of the switch.
So last question, and I'll have more questions later. Could they have put that in place before the accident?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Hamady. So I'll pose this to the panel, not sure who best would answer it, but how does a railroad typically check for compliance to make sure that their train and engine crews are complying with those procedures?
The way they check the crews or to make sure they have full understanding of the rules that apply and how they're supposed to be executed is through efficiency testing. The managers can set up a test. They don't have to wait for an event to happen. And the purpose of setting up a test is so you can check for compliance, make sure they stop, inspect the switch, line it back and forth, check for radio communication between the train dispatcher and the crew, and those are what they call structured. You set up the test, and that's how you test the employees and ensure that they understand what they need to do.
Yeah, good. So basically, that's the quality assurance to make sure that things are being done the way that they're supposed to be done.
Correct. And
So so it was the conductor of the CSX freight train that left this switch in the wrong position. Is that correct?
correct.
So let's look at the efficiency tests on page 92. You don't have to pull up that page, I will ask. But for the conductor, do you recall how many efficiency tests this conductor had for line switches and derails for their designated normal position?
He didn't have any on the main track. All of his efficiency tests were done in the yard. And the FRA regulations and the CSX testing manual, operational testing manual, requires that they get tested on every environment. So you have two completely different environments, the main track and the yard.
Great, so he had never been tested for line switches and derails for their designated normal operations, normal position. How about restore switches and derails on controlled tracks to their normal position before the movement is reported clear to the train dispatcher? How many efficiency tests?
He was never tested out there.
Zero. How about how many efficiency tests did CSX give him on before departing a location where the main track switch has been operated by hand? Each crew member must verbally confirm the position of the switches that the switches had been locked. How many efficiency tests did CSX give of this conductor?
None.
None. And how about EC1 operations rules 501? How many efficiency tests did CSX provide or give to this conductor?
None.
None. How about using the switch position awareness form?
None.
None. And finally, Rule 503.6, a train is instructed to take a track in TWCD or TWC ABS territory, must report clear to the train dispatcher once the train has cleared the main track and switches have been restored to the normal movement of the track. How many times did CSX perform a efficiency test of that conductor?
None.
None. So we went through 5 things that were very important, in fact, were material to this accident, and CSX never efficiency tests that conductor. Same questions for the engineer. How many?
None.
None. And of the, now the train masters for the Cayce yard were the ones who would be conducting this efficiency test. And of the same items that we just mentioned, by the way, in the year before this accident, Train Master 1 had conducted 2,670 efficiency tests. How many of those efficiency tests did this CSX Train Master give total related to those items we just mentioned?
None.
None. And the same question would apply to Train Master 2, who gave 2,311 efficiency tests. How many of those efficiency tests that he conducted were related to the items that we've just mentioned?
None.
So I would submit to you that CSX failed to ensure that this crew was properly prepared to perform the task that CSX assigned them to do on that night. Thank you. We'll go to the next round. Vice Chairman.
And we're getting into the nuts and bolts here of the human factors. Dr. Hoff, do you believe that the conductor did not understand the importance of properly aligning that switch?
I do think he fully understood the importance of lining that switch.
So even, I'm going to run contrary to the chairman here just a little bit, but even though he had not gotten training on this, it was pretty clear to him that it was critically important that that switch be aligned because he knew that there was a train coming on that track and that the switch had to be properly aligned. Is that correct? Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay. In terms of the operations within the system, we talked previously about checks and balances and the fact that this is done by verbal communication. How many times will somebody be queried on something like this to make sure that, in fact, the switch has been aligned properly?
Well, again, the FRA regulations in the CSX testing program require that they get tested on every environment that they work.
I'm not talking about testing, I'm talking about the actual verification that I said I threw the switch. Okay, you say you threw the switch, yes. Are you sure you threw the switch? Yes. How many times did that go through? Was that with both the conductor and the engineer? Was it with the conductor and the dispatcher? Was anybody else involved?
Before they even talk to the train dispatcher, they got to have a job briefing between themselves to verify the position of the switch.
Did
And
that happen?
No.
The conductor did not tell the engineer that he had aligned the switch?
After he released the authority, then the engineer asked him, did you line that switch back? And that's when they had that discussion, and the engineer asked him 3 times again. And he insisted he had lined the switch.
Okay, so that, whether it happened in the sequence that it should have, there were 2 checks on that. One was with the dispatcher, he released it, and then secondly with the engineer. Is that correct?
Correct.
He verified twice that he had in fact done it, and he had been checked on that. Dr. Huff, is there any level, until we totally automate systems, where we can expect error-free performance with humans?
You cannot expect error-free human performance,
Ever?
ever.
So no matter how many systems we put in place, there will always be human failure.
Yes.
So that would sort of say that no matter what we do, we're never going to get there, but we can improve it. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, again, as I alluded to earlier, human performance is very critical when you have administrative controls. When you have engineering controls in place, human performance becomes less of an issue. And with respect to administrative controls, not all of those are created equal. Some are better than others.
In the report, it was noted that the conductor did not have a watch or other suitable timekeeping device. Would that be required to do the job and in order to complete the SPAF? Is a watch essential for railroad operations by operational personnel?
The railroad requires that they have a timepiece, a watch. In this case, the conductor was relaying the information to the engineer that when he operated the switches, and the engineer wrote those times.
Did that happen contemporaneously, or was that after the fact?
Yeah, we never got a clear understanding of what they were doing. Yeah, we never found the SPAF form to verify what took place between them. But the timepiece itself, even if he didn't have it on his person, it did not impede him from lining that switch properly, or did not impede the crew from having the proper job briefing to verify the position.
And there was no record of the SPAF anywhere?
We did not find it.
So the crew knew that they were supposed to have a SPAF, but they didn't. But there wasn't one there.
That's correct. That was on the instructions for the signal suspension.
Okay, I'll defer to my next round, sir.
Great, thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Hamady.
Section 103 of the Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008 required railroads, or FRA, to implement a rule requiring railroads to adopt risk reduction programs or safety management systems. That was 11 years ago. We still don't have a final rule was issued in 2016 for passenger railroads, and then it was stayed how many times?
7.
7 times, as recently as maybe a month ago. So we have 11 years, then we have 1 year to implement. or to submit their plans to FRA for review and approval, and then another 3 years to actually implement whatever is reviewed and approved, so we're now at 15 years, assuming that the final rule actually goes into effect at any point in the near future. The law also required FRA to issue a rule, not just for passenger railroads, but also freight railroads to implement a risk reduction program or a safety management system. Has that, Mr. Hall, has that been issued, or what's the status of that?
No, it has not been issued. The FRA submitted a proposed rule to the RSAC, the Rail Safety Advisory Committee, but no rule has been approved by the Rail Safety Advisory Committee to move on to rulemaking.
The Rail Safety Advisory Committee essentially being a quote-unquote negotiated rulemaking committee where, in my opinion, everything goes and dies because they can't get anything through the RSAC process. So why are safety management systems important? And if CSX had implemented an SMS program, would they have analyzed the potential risk or should they have analyzed the potential risk of not providing redundant safety systems if they're suspending signals for work?
So safety management systems are very important. There's 4 different pillars of them. One of the important pillars is risk management. And with respect to what you said, yes, I believe CSX would have recognized that misaligned switches are a well-identified risk. This is a very high-risk situation, passenger train coming through, any train coming through. And this switch position awareness form has already been shown to be ineffective. That's why the FRA has removed it from their regulation, and it is a weak control.
So you actually said what I was looking for, which was it was a well-identified risk. We've investigated accidents that were in dark territory that were the result of a misaligned switch. Is that correct? Does anyone want to talk about some of the past ones? I can think of one in particular that actually is the reason why we have PTC, which was the one that occurred in Graniteville. And that led to the PTC mandate from Congress, actually. It was Chatsworth came later, but it was a Graniteville accident, and it was so well known that the railroads know that there is a serious safety deficiency if they have the potential for a misaligned switch, that they have to provide some safety redundancy for, and that's my point. So we're calling on FRA to again finalize the Part 270 System Safety Program, which is exactly what Congress required 11 years ago. In the meantime, though, one railroad actually submitted their system safety plan or their risk reduction plan without even being required to, because the final rule hasn't been implemented, and that's Amtrak. To your knowledge, Mr. Hall, has any other railroad done this?
No, no other railroads have done that to my knowledge.
And Amtrak is in the process of implementing SMS. How far are they in implementation?
They're just in the beginning, a year or two into it. After the Chester accident, we made recommendations regarding them proceeding with 270, even though it was not yet required. But they are making good progress, and comparing them to other industries where SMS has been implemented in aviation and in pipeline, they're well along the way to getting to a full SMS in a couple of years. Implementing an SMS is usually a multi-year process.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to come back and talk about that a little bit more in my next round.
Thank you, Member Hamady. Mr. Payan, you mentioned that the signal upgrade was going to go from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on Saturday, and they had also allowed for that same period of time on Sunday, I believe. It probably could, do you agree that it probably could have been completed had CSX not run a train through there, 3 trains through there, which really took up about 6 hours of the signal suspension?
Yes, they had planned it for 2 days, but the signal suspension was going to be in place until they finished. But the signal department was thinking they could do it in 2 days, or they scheduled it for 2 days, but they were thinking they could finish in 1.5 days. The trains that went in there, that were sent in there, the switching crews delayed it to the point where they had to stop for the day and continue the next day, and then the accident happened.
In fact, after the accident, when CSX went back to complete the signal upgrade, how long did it take for them to finish it and get it completed?
Well, that's a little misleading. It took 2 hours to complete it, but part of it was we were there, and they were doing it for us, and at the time, all train traffic was stopped because of the accident. So it was completed in 2 hours, but that might have been accurate if we weren't there, or it might have been a little longer. I can't tell.
So if they had not run those 3 trains through there on Saturday, is it likely that the signal upgrade could have been completed on the first day, which was Saturday, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.?
Yes, based on the interviews, post-accident interviews that were made, that were conducted, yes, they were confident that they could have finished in
So I think that's key right there, that CSX chose to run 3 trains through that signal suspension, which would have had a deleterious effect on the signal suspension, the signal upgrade. They chose that. They chose to run those 3 trains through there, correct?
That's correct.
And as Member Hamady led, the hazards of misaligned switches are well known to everyone in the railroad industry. Train and engine crews, dispatchers, train masters, management, which includes signal people routing trains, which I guess would be dispatchers. So knowing the hazards, what could CSX have done to have mitigated the risk associated with this? Because every time you flip a switch, there's always the hazard of the risk of not putting it back in the proper position, correct?
That's correct.
So what could CSX have done to have mitigated the hazard, the risk?
Just like other railroads have put in procedures for signal suspensions, they could have limited train movements through there. They could have ceased train operations through there. They could have locked out the switches to where only the signal department had access to them, and that would have been a redundancy check with a signal person having to line the switch instead of a train crew. Or they could have limited any kind of switching movements through there.
Absolutely. They could have limited the switching movement because this guy probably operated over 30 switches that night. Is that correct?
Mr. Tomas can answer that.
Many.
Maybe a little bit more than that, yeah.
Maybe more than that. And with every switch movement, like I said, there's the hazard of not repositioning it. And yet, they put this crew out there that night in a situation where they were constantly moving switches, including mainline switches, including the silica storage north signal, or north switch, which is the one that ultimately did not get relined. So CSX did not take measures to mitigate, proper measures to mitigate the risk associated with this. They did not have to choose to conduct a switching operation during the signal suspension. As Ruben said, Mr. Payan said, they could have chosen not to even operate trains through there. BNSF, as I understand it, has made the decision that they will not operate trains through an area of signal suspension. So there were a lot of things they could have done other than relying on these weak administrative controls, because invariably, humans will commit errors. We have to have enough redundancy in the system so that when that error is committed, that error will be trapped before bad things happen. And CSX failed to do that. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hall, I'm going to follow up on Member Hamody's question here. 49 CFR Part 270. Why is the FRA consistently delayed mandating this rule that was supposed to go in place much sooner?
Part 270 is intended to apply to passenger railroads, Amtrak and the commuter railroads. It is our understanding that it's over objections from the states that own commuter railroads or own trackage that commuter railroads operate on, because they were not included in the RSAC process that developed the rule.
That sounds like a pretty weak answer to me, not your part, but just the fact that we just don't feel like doing it, and we have this process that says this isn't sufficient. And I want to be very clear, I'm not exonerating CSX in my comments, but I think if we're going to hold people accountable, we should also hold the regulators accountable as well. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Is there anything pending right now, or is there anything changed from the regulatory perspective that would now include all railroads, since we saw from the very well laid out map that Amtrak spends most of its operating mileage on railroads that aren't their own. So they're operating in what they refer to as host railroads.
The mandate from the 2008 Rail Safety Improvement Act included risk management for both freights and passengers. And we've been talking about Part 270, which is passengers, but Part 271, which is the freights, as we said in the presentation, they proposed something in RSAC and it's never even come out of RSAC. So we are many years behind. In the latest delay of Part 270, FRA said that they wanted to combine it with 270, the implementation of 271. So they've now tied it to the proposed rule that's never come out of RSAC. So this particular delay will be much more significant than the previous ones.
Does the FRA have to rely on RSAC to get anything done?
No, FRA does have the ability to issue a rule outside of RSAC.
You know, it seems to me we have we're talking about the railroads and the systemic problems here and what's required and what isn't. And it seems like unless something is absolutely mandated, we're going to go to the lowest common denominator. At what point do we decide that we're not going to let economics drive this, which I think is probably the ultimate driver for some of the players here, and say enough? How many switch accidents have we had as a result of this? Any idea how many accidents as a result, and had these rules been implemented?
We don't have an exact count of the accidents, but as we said before, it's
a lot.
One of the highest number of incidents in the FRA database. So the fact that this has not been issued, these accidents continue to occur and will continue to occur until we get some meaningful regulations to evaluate the risk and mitigate the risk.
Okay, I will look forward in the findings to see something in that regard, because I think we keep, working down in the lower levels. I lose arguments with myself on that point. Dr. Hopf, do people ever fail in safety management system implementation in terms of the workforce?
Absolutely. The process of it's not a situation where you implement an SMS and you're done. It's an ongoing process of continual improvement.
Where have you seen that happen?
So SMS is relatively new in the rail industry, but I mean, I think Amtrak themselves has shown that they've been going through this process and they've made a lot of headway. And I think that as they go through, they find gaps and have been improving there. Even in the aftermath of this accident, I think Amtrak has really stepped up their safety management off property, and I think that was a hole that wasn't addressed in their safety management system prior. And the combination of DuPont and Cayce, I think Amtrak's leadership has really made a change there. So that's an example that I've seen recently.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Hamady.
Thank you. Amtrak was created in the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970, and Section 402 allowed Amtrak to enter into contracts with freight railroads or other railroads to use track and other facilities. How many host railroads does Amtrak have agreements with or contracts with, essentially operating agreements?
Approximately 29.
29. And can you talk a little bit about what is addressed, the general subjects that are addressed in an operating agreement?
Yes. Access to any rail line at U.S., use of host railroad facilities, payment based on host incremental costs, Amtrak preference over freight transportation, additional trains. Basically, they're track usage agreements.
And indemnification, right?
Correct.
So in this situation, CSX was indemnified, and Amtrak paid the cost, essentially, of the accident, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yep. So do these operating agreements address safety at all?
They are not safety documents. They do not address safety except to say that Amtrak will follow the safety rules of the host.
So the agreements themselves are actually allowed under current law. Has FRA ever looked at any of the operating agreements at all?
No, they have not.
They haven't. And is Amtrak able, or have they been able, to request changes from the host railroads, either through on safety, regardless of these operating agreements?
The Amtrak's efforts to manage safety off property have largely been increasing after the accident, and my understanding is that they've had a good amount of success and cooperation from the host railroads in those implementations.
Just on this property or others as well?
Generally across the board, we talked to several senior Amtrak officials, and they said generally they've had good agreement and good cooperation.
In fact, we issued an urgent safety recommendation that I'm hoping Mr. Hall or Mr. Hipskind, maybe you can talk about, which Amtrak was able to implement on CSX property.
After the accident, as we noted in the presentations, Amtrak notified all the host railroads that during any signal suspension on any host railroad, they would be operating at restricted speed. And I think it's fair for us to say that's been accepted. There's been a glaring absence of pushback from the host railroads. Now, where that goes in the future, I think that's left to be seen.
Okay, great. And Amtrak CEO Richard Anderson sat down for an interview with investigators and provided a glimpse into the process and work that's needed to implement SMS. Given the accident, has there been a change in the safety culture at Amtrak?
We believe so. And as Mr. Hall indicated earlier, it is a multi-year effort, and it will not be completed, I think Mr. Anderson said, probably at the end of 2020. But it doesn't end there. As Dr. Heft noted, it is a continuous program that never ends.
Well, and I'm going to use my remaining 56 seconds to really just congratulate Amtrak for taking those steps. I've worked with Amtrak for almost 2 decades. I worked with David Gunn, Alex Kumont, Joe Boardman, Wick Moorman, and now Richard Anderson, and I can tell you that no president and CEO of Amtrak prior to Richard Anderson focused as much as he is on safety. So I was really impressed by the interview, his responses to the questions, their submission to the board on what they're doing to enhance safety at Amtrak, their focus on safety, and their supplemental response that they just provided last week. Part of that is really just a change in the leadership at Amtrak, and I congratulate them, and I think the board is starting to look a little bit on safety too, which I'll talk about in the next round. But, you know, I have to give credit to them, but I also have to give credit to you all. The reason why they've gotten to this point is because a lot of the work that you did in these investigations. So congratulations and great job.
Member Hamady, thank you very much. The vice chairman asked a question, pointed out that there were about 900 signal suspensions that I think you said that CSX had conducted in a period of time. And the question was, why did it fail this time? Well, you know, we talk about sometimes layers of Swiss cheese and holes in the Swiss cheese. Do we know, and we probably don't, do we know of those 900 how many times they operated trains through those signal suspensions? I don't think we know that, do we?
No, we don't. The 900, I think, included more than just the PTC planned suspensions. Amongst the 900, if I'm correct, probably involved also unplanned suspensions where modifications or repairs were needed to the signal system.
Yeah, and so, you know, the factors were probably different. And the fact is, when I got a phone call at 4:30 in the morning on this Sunday, February the 4th, I was told of this collision and the switch was left in the wrong position and padlocked in that wrong position. We knew that within 2 hours of the accident. There's no question about it that the conductor committed an error. But as Dr. Heff has said, if we design a system where we're relying only on humans to perform perfectly, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. Because a long time ago, somebody a lot smarter than me wrote, "To err is human." So when we developed, in a former life, when we developed error management programs, we didn't assume that the error would not occur. We assumed that the error would occur, and then we put enough redundancy in that system so that when the error occurred, it was trapped or mitigated before bad things happen. And if you rely only on perfect human performance by completing a SPAF or by following procedures, which they should have done those things. But again, you're looking for failure. And we had failure that night. Let's switch now to Amtrak. Is there anything that the Amtrak crew, the engineer or the conductor on board that Amtrak train, is there anything that they could have done differently that night to have prevented this accident?
Staff does not believe so. They were in compliance and with the Amtrak's rules and the operating rules they were given.
Okay, thank you. And how about Amtrak, the company? What could they have done differently?
I think ideally, what I would like to have seen would have been for Amtrak to collaborate with CSX and ensure that their risk management ensured that risk was managed to a consistent low level and that they were not accepting a higher level of risk. I think had there been an evaluation of the risk associated with following Amtrak operating rules on the Northeast Corridor versus following CSX rules, they likely would have realized that there was a difference. And hopefully not even stop there, but have gone on to continue that process out and determine if that was the best way to approach that situation.
Thank you. Mr. Hibskin, I think you said in response to Member Hamody's question that there's not been a lot of pushback on Amtrak trying to impose their own rules when they're operating over host railroads, but I did read on page 78 of the draft report where the Vice President of Safety, Compliance, and Training told investigators that sometimes host railroads pushed back on what Amtrak wanted to do to mitigate risk. And so my point is that it can't all be up to Amtrak. It takes a cooperative agreement with the host railroads. It takes two to dance, two to tango, and Amtrak can go all day long and tell the host that we're going to do it this way, but if the hosts push back, then that puts Amtrak in a situation where they're like, well, what are we going to do? And so I'm pleased to see that we're proposing recommendations for those host railroads to work with Amtrak, because Amtrak is trying to do the right things. Okay, do you want to go to a third round or a fourth round, or do you want to go to a break? We'll keep going. Vice Chairman.
Okay. Dr. Hepp, do you believe that individuals have any responsibility to comply with rules or regulations?
Yes, absolutely.
So how would you put that in the context of what happened at Cayce? And specifically, obviously, we're looking at the conductor as someone who obviously made a mistake.
I believe that the conductor had every intention of following the rules and thought that he did. He just made a mistake.
I'd like to, one thing that I guess stood out for me was on page 71 of the draft report. This was the conductor's response to the NTSB's investigation. I quote, I prefer signals a lot of times because you don't have to write down the EC1s, and you know the dispatcher doesn't catch you off guard, emphasis added, and ask you where you're at. And you're not really sure where you're at and have to, you know, ask your engineer and stuff. What's your reaction to that statement?
So in talking to the conductor, it became apparent that this was not routine for him. Usually he'd done this job before, but the signals had been active. When the signals are active, his workload is less because he doesn't have to communicate with his dispatcher as much. He doesn't have to do the switch position awareness form. He's not having to write down these times. So there's an added workload. There's an additional task that he has to do. He had never done this task before with those those additional requirements. Now, he had been trained on those, but even with the best training, if you're out of practice with those, you're going to be susceptible to making a mistake. He reported that because this was, you know, he was out of practice with this, that he forgot to write down these times as he was going about doing them. Of course, we never found the switch position awareness form, so we can't verify that one was ever done. It's not clear.
Did he get a job briefing prior to going out on this assignment?
Yes, it did. He had a job briefing with the train master over the phone, and it was explained to him what needed to be done out there. They needed to fulfill, they were going to operate on EC1 authority and fill out their SPAF form.
So I would assume that we looked at that pretty thoroughly to see, you know, was the briefing sufficient for this individual to understand? Do you think he understood what his responsibilities were?
During the interviews, he expressed that he did. But going back to Dr. Heff, we found his EC1 logbook, and he has 22 EC1 entries from May of 2017 to the day of the accident. So he has worked on EC1 authority.
So that sounds a little bit contrary to what Dr. Heff just said, that he didn't know how to operate within this environment and was confused. It sounds to me like he knew what he was expected to do.
Well, that's what he expressed in the interviews. Dr. Hev is correct, that's exactly what he said in interviews, but his EC1 log shows otherwise.
Well, that strikes me as a rather interesting inconsistency, and based on his quote, that strikes me as sort of a casual attitude, if you will, on somebody who's in a safety-sensitive position.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify something. The particular job that he was doing that day, I meant he had never done with the EC1. He had done EC1s before, but not that particular job.
I think the chairman and I are going to have probably a slight different view on some of these things, which we'll get to shortly, but I think individuals who are in safety-sensitive positions have a responsibility in two ways. One is that they thoroughly understand what's expected of them, and Mr. Torres, you sound like he did understand what was expected of him.
According to the EC1 logbook, there's 22 entries, and he also logged in where he operated main track switches when he lined them and reversed them. He has his comments on there. So he's done this before.
Okay, thank you. I'll stop here, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. You indicated there were two things. Understand what's expected of him. What was the other one?
What was expected of him and his responsibility?
Thank you very much. Member Hamady.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and give some time to Dr. McKay to talk about medical issues that were identified in this accident investigation. If you could talk a little bit about the medical issues you identified and potential concerns.
So the FRA requires only that safety-sensitive employees in rail have a hearing test and an eye test every 3 years. Amtrak has a very robust system for ensuring fitness for duty. Its engineers undergo an evaluation by a healthcare provider that includes a review of medical conditions, medications, a set of vital signs, a physical examination, an EKG, and screening for sleep apnea. CSX performs hearing and vision screening. They also ask the individual this particular question, which I'm sorry I have to read because I can't remember the whole thing. During the last 3 years, or since you last worked for CSXT, whichever is longer, have you been treated by a physician for any conditions which could affect your ability to safely perform the essential functions of your job? Yes or no? No physical exam is performed, no vital signs are taken, no review of medical conditions or medications is performed. So there's very big discrepancy in terms of what we know about how fit for duty the Amtrak crew was versus how fit for duty the CSX crew was. And we feel strongly that this is a real hazard and belongs in the safety management system, along with track and operations and signals.
And how does that compare for the freight railroads to, say, other industries where there would be medical screening?
So all commercial drivers have to undergo a review of medical conditions, medications, a physical examination. And their limitation is a maximum of 2 years. All merchant mariners undergo the same, a complete examination. All aviators, now with the exception of those covered under basic med, but other than that, all pilots at least once have to undergo a complete physical examination, review of medications, a normal physical examination.
And do we have recommendations in this area?
We have existing recommendations to FRA and to all of the Class 1s, passenger and commuter railroads.
And what has FRA's response been?
FRA has told us they will not be acting on our recommendation. However, the railroads have taken it upon themselves to make significant changes. And when I say that, I mean Amtrak multiple commuter railroads, including LIRR and Metro North, multiple transit operations, including New Jersey Transit and the Union Pacific. In fact, the only two large freights that have an examination limited to vision and hearing are CSX and BNSF.
Thank you. I'm going to also switch gears back to an issue that it's not entirely related to this accident, but we had a signal suspension, and while we had signals, it was essentially dark territory because they didn't have reliable signal indications. They were told to essentially ignore what they had up on the screens. And so dark territory, when Congress actually asked the railroads last year how much dark territory exists in the U.S. rail network, and they responded with maybe 18,000 track miles. When I look at CSX's submission to the NTSB, it actually says they have 6,000 track miles, of which are dark territory, which is pretty significant. So I feel like the 18,000 total for all 7 Class 1 railroads, plus everybody else out there, is probably low. So can you talk to me just really quickly, what is the difference here during the signal suspension and dark territory? There's none, right? You're essentially still operating on track warrant.
You're basically taking a signal territory and suspending the signals and reverting to the non-signal territory rules that the railroad uses in other parts of its railroad.
Okay, so we have a proposed safety rec to CSX calling on them to develop a device or technique to eliminate the possibility of an employee failing to perform critical tasks. What kind of device are we talking about? Can you talk about that at all? What's out there?
Well,
Switch position monitoring? I don't know.
From Graniteville, I was on that accident, and they were looking for something that would remind the crew members that were actually throwing the switch of the position, either a flashing light, a strobe, or a banner. Not so much for the train crews, but more for not so much for trains approaching that area, but for train crews on the ground that would show them a quick reference of where the switch is lying.
And I'm glad you said that because we did issue a recommendation in Graniteville on this, and I'm almost done in a second. We did issue a recommendation on Graniteville on this, and then in 2008, Congress enacted a law in Section 406, Development and Use of Rail Safety Technology, which required the FRA to prescribe standards, guidance, regulations, or orders governing the development, use, and implementation of rail safety technologies in dark territory, to require implementation, for example, of switch position monitoring devices or indicators. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what FRA did on this requirement, which was 11 years ago? It starts with an N. Nothing. So yet again, I think we have some problems at the FRA right now when it comes to these issues. Here we have something that could have been dark territory. It wasn't dark territory, but pretty close, and safety measures should have been implemented.
Thank you, Member Hamady. Mary, Dr. McKay, I want to follow on to Member Hamady's line of questioning. How was the emergency response for this accident?
I have personally been on about 6 on-scene investigations in which I have personally interviewed emergency response teams and staff. This was hands down the most well-organized emergency response I have ever seen. Not only were the services integrated, meaning law enforcement, multiple law enforcement groups, the county EMS, they called in mutual aid, and the fire department, there really was shared responsibility, and they very quickly were able to get the injured off the scene and the uninjured also off the scene and taken care of.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that, and thank you very much. And what can you say, characterize about the injuries, where more injuries occurred and what may have led to those injuries?
So we know that nearly 80% of those seated in coach seats were injured and were taken to the hospital. Less than 20% of those in a bunk, either a roomette or a bedroom, were injured and taken to the hospital. Now, part of that is that the sleeper cars were at the end of the train, so they saw less of a velocity change. The majority of those who were taken to the hospital had been thrown out of the seats they were sitting in and thrown either against the seat in front of them or into the aisleway. As you know, it's a train, there are no restraints, but there's also a fairly big space between the seats, and that gave people room to be thrown head first. So we saw quite a few injuries to the head and face, as well as lower extremity injuries.
Well, that's fascinating, and we've certainly talked about this issue of survivability in the past. In fact, just 2 months ago on the DuPont accident, the Amtrak accident that occurred in DuPont. We have recommendations for FRA to look into ways that survivability, I think, can be improved, including the possibility of using seat belts. And do you have any comments about that at all? I just think the notion of compartmentalization in a school bus, I get it, because there's only that much distance between the rows of seats. In trains, you have massive amounts of space between seats and tables, and people can flail around. Do you have thoughts on that?
Certainly, I think restraints are one option. Realize that they really can't be retrofitted because of the issue of the way the seats are attached to the floor. And so it would require a significant redesign. We believe that that's one option. There are other options for breakaway tables, for other softer things to be on the far side of that large compartment. It really is up to the FRA to do the research, and I'm going to ask Ms. Sanzo to comment on this as well.
No, just to pick up on what Dr. McKay has talked about, we made prior recommendations on the subject of enhanced, better research on occupant protection, and we intentionally left it open to account for all the possibilities that Dr. McKay has just discussed. And we are, in this report, reiterating those recommendations.
Well, I want to thank you, Ms. Sanzo, and you, Dr. McKay, for your work in that respect, because that's how we can further improve safety is through improving occupant protection and crash survivability issues. It's been mentioned that we issued in the wake of this accident, we came out with an urgent safety recommendation. It's R1805. Which says basically when you're operating during signal suspension, a train should approach the location of the switch at a very slow speed, at restricted speed, such that if the switch is not in the right position, the train can be stopped. What has FRA done on that?
We issued that recommendation 11 days after the accident because we were very concerned. This was the second accident we saw in the PTC cutover. FRA did not issue an emergency order. In fact, they've issued a safety advisory. We first found out about the safety advisory by reading it in the Federal Register. They didn't even bring that to us in a letter to say that that was their intent. That safety advisory was finally issued in November. We were really concerned about the timing because of all the PTC cutovers going on, and thought that strong, fast action was needed.
And as a result of FRA's inaction or failure to do what we've asked them to do, what is staff proposing? How is staff proposing that recommendation be treated?
We are proposing that recommendation be closed unacceptable.
And I plan to support that. Thank you very much. Why don't we take a 15-minute break? We'll come back according to that clock, which is a little fast. Well, let's give it real time. Let's come back at, 11:25.
guys all good up here?
We're good. Actually feels really good up here. Shocking.
Really? I think it's warm compared to the pizza.
We'll get started here in about 1 minute. We are back in session, and we'll go to the next round. Vice Chairman Lansberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really don't have questions at this point, but just a couple of statements. It seems like we have made several recommendations on what would seem to be a pretty obvious engineering fix, and that is the conspicuity of switches, alignment on the main line, either temporarily or permanently when work is being done there. And I sort of wonder why that hasn't been done. Hold that thought, I'll get back to it. Seatbelts seem like a really good idea because we've found them in all other vehicles to be helpful. I will point out that the airline industry has taken compartmentalization to a high art form. There's absolutely no space, but on the railroads, it seems like the seatbelt would be a good way to go forward, particularly if on compartmentalization, which we learned on school buses, doesn't always work, particularly if there's sideway forces. I guess the final point I'd like to make, in addition to saying that I think crew members have responsibility, companies have responsibility, and daggone it, the Federal Railway Administration has responsibility here, and it seems like they have been doing an awful lot of foot dragging. And how long does it take to get something reasonable through to prevent some of these accidents? So I don't expect anybody to respond to that. It's just reflecting my frustration with, again, what seems to be a very obvious solution to many of these problems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. And Vice Chairman, or excuse me, Member Hamady.
Thank you. The proposed probable cause says that the NTSB determines the probable cause of this collision of trains was the failure of CSX to assess and mitigate the risk associated with operating through a signal suspension, which allowed a CSX conductor to leave a switch in the reverse position, and it goes on from there. Why do we start with CSX? Mr. Hall.
If we look at the FRA database on railroad accidents, human performance and human failure is #1 cause of accidents. And so we have to have processes in place, as the chairman said, to trap those critical errors so they don't become serious accidents. And putting CSX first was based on the fact that by the signal suspension and the rules they put in place, they took away the safety redundancy that would have trapped the accident, trapped the error that caused this accident. And so we feel it's very important that those processes, those systems that are at the corporate level be called out for the probable cause of this accident.
And in addition to the FRA safety database, but we do know from earlier that there's a history of misaligned switches, and that actions need to be taken to prevent that. So we're not saying that the conductor had no responsibility, but we are saying that CSX had the primary responsibility of having to ensure safety of all train operations on their territory, correct?
Absolutely.
Thank you. That's my last question.
Thank you very much. Let's talk about the FRA some more. What more could the Federal Railroad Administration have done in the probable cause, the draft probable cause we talk about, the FRA's failure to implement effective regulations to mitigate the risk of misaligned switch accidents? What more could they have done?
With the FRA, if we go back to Section 103 of the Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008, where they were mandated by Congress to implement risk reduction rules by October 2012. If FRA had issued those rules, I don't think we would be here today.
And is that known as Part 270?
Yeah, it's what's known as, 270 and 271, the passenger and the freight.
And how many times has Part 270 been stayed now?
It has been stayed 7 times.
And 2 months ago, when we sat in this boardroom and talked about an Amtrak accident in DuPont, Washington, in my opening statement, I commented that I hope we won't be sitting here because originally, for stay number 6, it was supposed to be implemented in September. And we said we hope that this doesn't happen again, and yet what happened in June?
Yeah, right after the board meeting, right after our report was prepared, they stayed it again.
Unbelievable, but yet true. We have a finding, and I want to make sure that people in the room understand what we're talking about. It's a proposed finding number 14. We say Amtrak has not yet articulated nor implemented a strategy to integrate all aspects of host railroad operations into its SMS. Now, I do believe, from meeting with Amtrak and reading their submission, I do believe that they are doing a lot. So what more do we believe that they should be doing?
Again, yeah, to Amtrak's credit, they have made an awful lot of progress. And one of the comments that I really like is that they're focusing on areas that do not have PTC. And I think that's a great start to the strategy. What I'd like to see Amtrak do is update their system safety program plan to create a comprehensive strategy talking about all aspects of host railroad operations, and just point out everything from dispatching, maintenance, everything that they're going to do to manage risk to a safe, acceptable level.
So while we're talking about Amtrak, can you outline a few of the measures that Amtrak has taken since this accident?
Well, one of the big things that Amtrak has done is now when they get notification of a signal suspension, they conduct a risk assessment, and they've been implementing largely operational mitigations. I believe they said the most common one is approaching a facing point switch, prepared to stop. So that's a great example of what they've done. And they've had some broader level of measures as well. Like I said, conducting risk assessments in areas where PTC is not active yet.
Yeah, thank you very much. I read in Richard Anderson's interview, and I've got to say, I was very impressed. I know I've read a lot of these things over the years. I've seen a lot of rhetoric, but Richard is backing up his words with actions. We said this 2 months ago. I sent this submission to some friends of mine in the railroad industry and to a group in the pipeline industry that I spoke to last week. I think this is a must-read. It talks about just culture, it talks about risk management, and I'm impressed. One thing that disturbs me is that Amtrak wants to have a just culture. In other words, if someone on their system commits an error and they report it to Amtrak, they want to say, okay, we've learned from that error. Thank you for telling us about it. That's how we're going to learn. We're not going to learn if we punish people. And yet, either the host railroad or the FRA will impose penalties. So how do we get the regulator? How do we get other railroads to understand the importance of a just culture? How do we crack that nut? Because until we get a just culture, the railroads are going to continue to operate at the turn of the century. And I'm not referring to the turn of the century that occurred 19 years ago. And I'm talking about from a safety management point of view. How do we get them over that barrel, over that hurdle?
You touch on a great point. Safety culture is everything. You can have great risk management and process, but if you don't have the culture to back that up, you're not going to get the results that you want. You need to have those assurances in place. Unfortunately, the railroad industry, a lot of people have adopted this follow the rules mentality. And, the data that you collect is not going to be accurate if people are afraid to report information accurately. And that's, we talked a lot about this after the Chester accident in 2016. And it's a change of culture, and changing culture is not easy.
Thank you very much. Vice Chairman, I think you have no more questions, I believe, or do you, Member Hamady? Well, with that, Deputy Managing Director Paul Sledzik, if you would kindly read the findings, and I think we had some, so how do we plan to deal with that? Will you just make the pen and ink corrections as you speak, or how would you like to do that?
Correct, yes, there's 2 points I'd like to make before I read the findings.
Thank you.
First, that in the course of making the corrections that the board members had offered in the final draft, there were some misnumberings of the finding numbers in the body of the report versus what I will read here at the end. So those will be corrected in the final. Also, there are 3 findings in which the finding at the end of the report in the roll-up was slightly different than what was in the body of the report. I will note those when I read those, and what I will be reading is what is in the body of the report, and that's what you will be voting on, okay? So we can clarify that.
Great.
Does that help?
So, I'm sorry?
Does that help, sir?
I think so, and I want to make sure my colleagues are okay with that. So the body of the report has the correct wording, but apparently that in some cases that new wording did not propagate to the actual finding section.
The printed finding section, but I will read them from the body of the report, the actual text from the body, so that will be what you will be voting on. Okay, and there's only 3, and I'll make those notes as we go along.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, there are 18 proposed findings for this accident. Number 1, the NTSB concludes that none of the following was a factor in this accident: the mechanical readiness of the train or the condition of the track. Finding 2, no medical condition or use of any medication by the Amtrak crew contributed to the circumstances of the accident. Finding 3, due to the limited available medical information for the CSX train crew, it could not be determined whether any medical condition or use of medication contributed to the circumstances of the accident. Finding 4, the majority of passenger injuries resulted from the passengers being thrown from their seats when the trains collided and derailed. Finding 5, although the passenger equipment safety standards in Title 49 Code of Federal Regulations Part 238 provide some level of protection for occupants, the current requirements are not adequate. Finding 7, the 2-person train crew performing switching that required the use of main track switches would have benefited from an additional train crew member assisting with the operation of the main track switches, because in this unique situation, the signal system did not provide a second level of safety for the operation of the main track switch. Next finding is 7. This is a finding that I'll be reading from the body of the report. There's one small change that I will note. The CSX train crew performed switching operations in the accident area for about 6 hours in a changed operating environment, inserting that word operating from the body of the text, of a signal suspension without sufficient planning, a risk assessment, and the implementation of appropriate risk mitigations. Okay, everyone have that? So operating is inserted between changed and environment in that finding. Next is finding 8. This also has a change, which I will note. The changed environment, and I'm inserting from the body of the text, of a signal suspension. The changed environment of a signal suspension not only challenges the movement of trains and operating crews, but also limits the effectiveness of the operating rules and regulations. I'll pause, you can catch up on that. So it's the changed environment of a signal suspension. Next is finding 9. No changes here. The CSX crew efficiency tests for the operation of main track switches, EC1 authority, or the SPAF, the Switch Position Awareness Form, failed to ensure safety. Finding 10, the CSX conductor's failure to realign the north end silica storage switch was an error of omission. Finding 11, the Switch Position Awareness Form is an ineffective control that did not mitigate the risk of an improperly lined switch. And finding number 12, and again, a change here. I will read it from the body of the report. CSX failed to properly assess and mitigate the risk associated with conducting switching operations with the signals suspended. I'll read it one more time. Finding 12, CSX failed to properly assess and mitigate the risk associated with conducting switching operations with the signals suspended. Okay, finding 13, the Federal Railroad Administration has failed to implement effective regulation to mitigate the risk of misaligned switch accidents. Finding 14, Amtrak has not yet articulated nor implemented a strategy to integrate all aspects of host railroad operations into its SMS or safety management system. Finding 15, this accident again shows that to improve safety for the public, Amtrak needs to implement an SMS, safety management system, on all operations, whether internal or on a host railroad. Finding 16, the application of safety management principles must be uniform across the Amtrak network. Finding 17, repeated postponement of Title 49 Code of Federal Regulations Part 270 System Safety Program by the Federal Railroad Administration has delayed needed safety improvements for the passenger rail industry and the traveling public. And lastly, finding 18, to improve its risk management processes, CSX will need to develop and implement a safety management system. That concludes the findings, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sledzik. Are there any proposed amendments? Right. With that in mind, Mr. Sledzik, if you'd please read the proposed probable cause.
Yes, sir. Staff proposes the following probable cause. Yeah.
Hang on a second. Thanks.
I thought we were out of sequence
No,
there,
I
sir.
appreciate it. As you know, I was expecting an amendment there, and it didn't happen, so thank you, Sean, and everyone else. Do we have a motion to adopt the findings as proposed? It's been moved by Member Hamady, seconded by the Vice Chairman. Is there any discussion? All in favor, kindly signal what. So it's been moved and seconded to adopt the findings as proposed. All in favor, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The findings have been proposed, have been adopted as proposed. Thank you. Now, sir, if you'll kindly read the probable cause.
Yes, sir. The National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause of this collision of trains was the failure of the CSX Transportation Corporation to assess and mitigate the risk associated with operating through a signal suspension, which allowed a CSX conductor to leave a switch in the reverse position, routing Amtrak train P91 onto a track where it collided with a standing CSX train. Contributing to the accident was the Federal Railroad Administration's failure to implement effective regulation to mitigate the risk of misaligned switch accidents. Also contributing to the accident was Amtrak's failure to conduct a risk assessment prior to operating during a signal suspension.
Thank you for reading that, and I believe we have a few proposed amendments, and we'll start in order of seniority. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment to offer. I move to replace the language in the probable cause, so it would now read, "The National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause of this train collision was the failure of the CSX conductor to realign the switch to the silica storage track to the main line at the conclusion of the switching operation, and the failure of the CSX Transportation Corporation to assess and mitigate the risk associated with operating through a signal suspension routing Amtrak train P91 onto a track where it collided with a standing CSX train. Contributing to the accident was the Federal Railroad Administration's failure to implement effective regulation to mitigate the risk of misaligned switch accidents. Also contributing to the accident was Amtrak National Railroad Passenger Corporation's failure to conduct a risk assessment prior to operating during a signal suspension. That is my motion.
Great, thank you. It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second only for discussion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Discussion? Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only thing I'm changing here is that we find the conductor as the initial cause of this accident. There is no question that there was a systemic failure, and we generally take a systemic view on these things. But I also feel that we have a responsibility to identify when individuals in safety-sensitive positions should also be held responsible. What we have here very clearly is a systems-induced error. I absolutely agree with that. The challenge is that when you have a system and it's operating and it has not been changed, then it's incumbent upon the people who are operating in that system to function around it. I'll use my aviation experience as background. Let's take fuel selector switches on airplanes. On older aircraft, there is not a lockout on the off position. And occasionally pilots would turn the switch to the off position and the airplane would no longer fly. So they redesigned the system and said we should, new airplanes coming out would have this particular lockout device. However, unless you bought a new airplane or retrofitted your old airplane, it was incumbent upon you to operate the system as it existed until it got changed. That's the circumstance we find ourselves in here. While we have recommended that this be done, and I think we all agree that CSX has great responsibility here, as likewise does FRA, until the system is changed, we have to depend upon individuals to make it work. So I feel that in this particular case, the conductor, and I think this came out in our discussions earlier, the conductor understood what he was supposed to do. He had done this several times before. We had ample examples of hundreds of successful signal suspensions without a problem because those individuals took their responsibility seriously. So I think it's appropriate and in accordance with what I think is good root cause, we should say this individual did not perform. I would also draw your attention to the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineer and Trainmen, who was the union who's responsible for protecting these people. Their party submission on probable cause supports this recommended change. Their statement was the probable cause of this accident and the fatalities of 2 Amtrak employees was the failure of the conductor of the CSX train to restore the switch to the north end position of the silica track. And so I think if the union feels the same way that there is a responsibility here. I don't think we can totally abdicate that individuals, when you are operating in an imperfect system, have responsibility. I do not absolve CSX, Amtrak, or the Federal Railroad Administration from their level of responsibility, but I think that the sequence of our determination carries weight. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, thank you very much. Member Hamady, would you like to?
A quick clarification on that. The union that actually represents the conductor is not the BLET. It is actually SMART. The BLET actually represents the engineers, and I think they would probably say they would want to read this to determine what their position would be. With that said, I don't support the amendment, and here's why. There is a history of accidents that have occurred due to misaligned switches. That is well documented. We have investigated many of those accidents. In fact, a misaligned switch, like I said, was the reason why we have PTC in the first place. Second, the FRA safety database does say, and it has for at least the last decade, said that human error is the #1 cause of accidents. That is well known. You have a railroad who did not have a safety management system, probably could have, had they implemented a safety management system, this accident likely would have occurred, but you had a situation where for 23 miles of track on a weekend, they changed the operating environment on the crew. The railroad did not implement the measures to ensure safety that other railroads do for signal suspensions. And those are well documented. And the last point I think I would really like to make is just calling attention to CSX's submission to the board, which says, nevertheless, after the accident, CSX immediately analyzed how it could ensure an accident like this would never happen again. They go on to talk about all the changes they made. So #1, they immediately recognized there was a problem. They didn't take action, but then they realized after the accident, they could have taken measures like other railroads do to ensure safety and to reduce the probability of an accident occurring due to human error. My old boss, Chairman Obastar from Minnesota, would have said that's a tombstone mentality. When you implement safety measures after an accident occurs, it is incumbent on railroads and operators to reduce the probability of human error-caused accidents. There were a lot of measures that they could have implemented in this case. They didn't. With that said, I do agree there is responsibility for the conductor to ensure that that switch was in the right position. That cannot be ignored. It was incumbent on the crew to ensure safety as well, so we can't say that's not a factor here, and that's the last point I'll make.
Well, thanks. I think we all agree that no one here is saying that the conductor should not be included in the probable cause. I think what the real issue here is where is the weighting? Does CSX go first, or does the conductor go first? And I do believe that an organization has the responsibility to prepare their people to do their jobs, to do it successfully, to do it safely. And we did say, as Member Hamady said, that there were several options that CSX could have taken. They could have, I don't know how easy it would have been to bring the signals back up, probably not easy, but they could have decided, as other railroads have done, they could have decided not to run trains through there. They could have decided not to send those 3 trains through there, which actually delayed the signal suspension and carried it over until the next day, which is what the circumstances were around this accident. In other words, CSX made the decision to run those 3 trains through there, which delayed it. They could have completed it 6 hours before this wreck, but they didn't. They could have said, you know what, switching operations are they're hazardous because every time we move a switch, we have to remember to move it back. And every time you do that, there's a likelihood of error. So they could have said, we're going to not do switching operations during signal suspension. But they did not do that. So I fall back on the notion that CSX is truly the root of this problem. You talk about root cause. I think really root cause would start with the proximate error. The proximate error here is the conductor failed to reline the switch. But if you really dig down, that's what the root is. That CSX put this crew in a position that they could and would and did fail. I'd love to hear staff's opinion, and then we can come back to the board.
Staff views this as, well, one, the way that we proposed our recommendation, but CSX had many opportunities to prevent this accident. And the conductor's action was the last step. There should have been many barriers to preventing that accident causing a collision. So staff really believes that CSX and the management of CSX belong first and foremost in the probable cause.
Thank you.
I'm fully prepared to be outvoted here, but I think we're talking about a relatively minor change in the probable cause. Everybody bears responsibility, but at some point there has to be a last line of defense. And we here have the benefit of hindsight, as does Congress, as does this organization. And I think things become much clearer, and you can say, well, there's tombstone mentality. Yes, there is. And I think we've made that very clear in our probable cause findings. But at some point, safety critical individuals have to line up. And as you've heard from the responses from the staff, this conductor knew what was expected of him. He knew he was operating in a dangerous situation, and he was totally casual in his response to doing so. So, as I say, I fully expect to lose on this, but I think as we talk about proximate cause, sir, we ought to do that, and we absolutely do not exonerate any of the others.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Hamady. So, I go back to when I stood in this room on September the 14th, of 2006, when I was swearing in ceremony, and I said my view of accident investigation philosophy is that we don't want to just point the finger to the last person who made the last mistake. We've got to understand the underlying conditions that enabled that error to occur. And I do believe, I think you're right, that this person did understand, as does everybody in the rail industry, the importance of what's expected, that when you flip a switch, you have to move it back at the appropriate time. And I think he did understand his responsibility. But again, I go back to the notion that an organization such as CSX has the responsibility to make sure that their employees are properly trained and that there's a quality assurance on that. And at my very first line of questioning, we went through and we saw clear evidence that CSX was not doing efficiency tests on the very things that led to this accident. And the point I raised in the investigative hearing last July was, it's easy to go out and do operational efficiency tests on things that like slips, trips, and falls, but what are the things that really kill people? And they weren't checking for that area. So, Vice Chairman, I certainly respect your viewpoint, and I think that this discussion is absolutely fascinating because it lets the world see how the agency looks at things. So, are there any other points that anyone would like to make? If that's the case, then with your permission, I'll call for the question and we'll vote.
Please.
Okay, great, thanks. So there's an amendment is proffered by the Vice Chairman and seconded for discussion by Member Hamady. It's been read. There's no further discussion. All in favor of this amended probable cause, signal with a hand and say aye. Aye. Okay, there's one. And opposed, please raise your hand and say nay. There are two nays, so the motion fails to pass. Is there another proposed amendment?
I have an amendment regarding the probable cause.
Sorry, I apologize. I recognize you to read the probable
Okay.
cause, please.
I
I'm sorry.
offer the following to amend I offer an amendment to the probable cause as follows. The National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause of this collision of trains was the failure of the CSX Transportation Corporation to assess and mitigate the risk associated with operating through a signal suspension, which eliminated system redundancy for detecting a switch in the wrong position. The CSX conductor failed to properly reposition the switch for the main track, which allowed National Railroad Passenger Corporation train P91 to be routed onto the silica storage track where the standing CSX train F777 was located. Contributing to the accident was the Federal Railroad Administration's failure to implement effective regulation to mitigate the risk of misaligned switch accidents. Also contributing to the accident was Amtrak's failure to conduct a risk assessment prior to operating during a signal suspension.
Thank you for that. It's been moved. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Discussion. Member Hamady.
Well, I think what bothered me about, I agree with you on the intent of the probable cause. I think what bothered me about the probable cause as proposed were the words "which allowed a CSX conductor." I do think absolutely CSX, number one, had the primary responsibility for ensuring safety on the system, and it was incumbent on them to take appropriate actions to mitigate the potential for an accident. With that said, it's also the responsibility of the conductor, as we've stated on page 130, to be mindful of his actions and other train crews in ensuring that switches are properly lined. So I provide a little bit more context on the need for system redundancy and how that was not provided, but at the same time, I am attempting to also add or clarify that it was also a responsibility for the crew, but primarily CSX.
Vice Chairman?
I could probably go along with that.
Thank you.
Grudgingly, but probably.
Thank you. And Member Hamady, when you talk about CSX, I'm sorry, the CSX eliminated system redundancy for detecting a switch left in the wrong position. What are you referring to there?
There really wasn't any redundancy for safety other than I don't consider a track warrant a redundant safety system. That is just voice permission, verbal permission to go into a block and operate. That's not a safety system, and it's not, and they certainly didn't provide anything, whether it was training or a redundant system or procedures in place that would have ensured safety in this situation.
And so one form of redundancy would be if they did not have a signal suspension in place. If the signals were there, because this switch was out of position, as the Amtrak approached, they would have gotten a red signal. They would have gotten a red aspect. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so that's a layer of redundancy that is there, that would have been there had they not had signal suspension. Another layer of redundancy would be that the dispatcher would have seen on his dispatch board a track occupancy light, I believe. Is that correct, or not necessarily?
Correct.
It would have been a track, I'm sorry, Ruben. Yes. So there would have been layers of redundancy. There would have been the red aspect for the Amtrak to see, to say, hey, stop, can't go past this, and at the dispatch board as well.
Correct. The dispatcher would not be allowed to line the route with the switch in the wrong position.
Right, I see, yes, he couldn't align the route with a switch in the wrong position. And as we know, a SPAF is not a very reliable, in fact, the FRA quit recommending the use of a signal position awareness form because of the lack of reliance. So they did reduce the redundancy. Does staff have comments on what Member Hamady has proposed and the Vice Chairman has seconded?
Staff supports the proposed amendment.
Thank you. Further comments? Vice Chairman? Okay, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the probable cause as amended by Member Hamady and as seconded by the Vice Chairman. It's been moved and seconded. No further discussion. All in favor of adopting the amendment, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed, there are none. We have a unanimous probable cause statement. Thank you, colleagues. So we have just adopted the probable cause, so really I think we can move. This is the one that always gets me. Okay, we've got a probable cause. Now let's go to the proposed recommendations. Mr. Sledzik, if you'd please read those.
Yes, sir. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 3 new safety recommendations. 2 of these will go to the CSX Transportation Corporation. Number 1, develop a device or technique to eliminate the possibility of employees failing to perform critical tasks such as lining a switch, lining a derail, or ensuring cars are clear of the main track. And the second, develop and implement a safety management system that includes, but is not limited to, operations, training, maintenance, equipment, and medical standards. And 1 new recommendation to all host railroads. Work in partnership with Amtrak to establish safety management criteria that support the implementation of Amtrak's safety management system. We're also reiterating 5 recommendations in this report. 4 of these are to the Federal Railroad Administration, and I'll read these. First is recommendation R16-35, which reads, conduct research to evaluate the causes of passenger injuries in passenger rail car derailments and overturns, and evaluate potential methods for mitigating those injuries, such as installing seat belts in rail cars and securing potential projectiles. Next is R16-36. When the research specified in safety recommendation R16-35 identifies safety improvements, use the findings to develop occupant protection standards for passenger rail cars that will mitigate passenger injuries likely to occur during derailments and overturns. Next is R18-10. Require railroads to develop a device or technique to eliminate the possibility of employees failing to perform critical tasks such as lining a switch, lining a derail, or ensuring cars are in the clear. And the last one to the FRA is R17-17. Enact Title 40 Code of Federal Regulations Part 270 System Safety Program without further delay. And there's 1 reiterated recommendation to Amtrak, that is R19-27, which states, work collaboratively with all host railroads and states that own infrastructure over which you operate in an effort to develop a comprehensive safety management system program that meets or exceeds the pending Federal Railroad Administration Regulation, Title 49, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 270, System Safety Program. And lastly, with terms of recommendations, we propose to reclassify 2 previously issued recommendations to the Federal Railroad Administration. That is, first one is R18-05, the urgent rec that was discussed earlier, which reads, issue an emergency order directing railroads to require that when signal suspensions are in effect and a switch has been reported relined for a main track, the next train or locomotive to pass the location must approach the switch location at restricted speed. After the switch position is verified, the train crew must report to the dispatcher that the switch is incorrectly lined for the main track before trains are permitted to operate at maximum authorized speed. We are now recommending this recommendation be closed unacceptable action. And the last is R18-10. Require railroads to develop a device or technique to eliminate the possibility of employees failing to perform critical tasks such as lining a switch, lining a derail, or ensuring cars are in the clear. And we propose that this recommendation be classified as open unacceptable response.
Member Hamady, please.
Mr. Sledzik, just to clarify, can you read the last reiterated recommendation to FRA? I think it was number 4, one more time.
Give me 1 second, ma'am. So that would be, ma'am, enact Title 40 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 270, System Safety Program without further delay, R1717.
Okay, I think that means I have an amendment.
Yeah, that should be Part 49.
That particular recommendation was included in the change pages that were submitted because it was inadvertently deleted from the report. And so when we submitted the change pages middle of last week, that was added back in.
Yeah, but the point is, it should not say Title 40. It should say Title 49.
Ah.
Isn't that right? Yeah.
Yes.
And you're
That's
the one,
correct, yeah.
you're the one that caught it. You're the one that caught it. So can we make, from a process point of view, can we make a pen and ink correction right now and acknowledge that that should, go ahead, sir?
We can make that change.
I want to be careful about findings and all, because if they're changed, but we did that on the findings, or in this case, a recommendation, but okay, so really, for clarification, I want my colleagues to understand that number 4, under reclassified, under reiterated, it should say, enact Title 49, strike 40, enact Title 49, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 270, Part. Say that again? That's right. So another part, another pen and ink change. So it should say, enact Title 49, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 270, System Safety Program, without further delay, and that's R17-17.
Correct, sir.
Okay, and everybody understands what that is? That's what we'll be voting on. Thank you for catching that, because I sure didn't. Okay, are there any motions to adopt, or excuse me, are there any amendments? I don't see any. Okay, there are none. Do I have a motion to adopt the recommendations as proposed? The Vice Chairman has moved. The Member Hamady has seconded. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the recommendations as proposed, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed, there are none. The recommendations have been passed unanimously. As far as adopting the final report, I think we have a few amendments for the language of the report, and we can go in order. Why don't we'll go to you first.
Sure.
Member Hamady?
I offer a motion to amend the report on page 156. I'll give you a second to get there. On page 156, we're looking at line 4 and 5. You would strike lines 4 and 5 and insert the following. The Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008, Section 103, directed FRA to create a mandatory risk reduction program, a major element of a safety management system for passenger and freight railroads, and established a deadline for the enactment of a final rule of October 16, 2012. FRA has issued a final rule on passenger railroads, which has been stayed and not enacted. FRA has proposed rules in the Rail Safety Advisory Committee for the Class 1 freight railroads. These rules have not yet been approved by the RSAC. At this time, it is unknown when the FRA will complete its rulemaking.
There's a motion. Is there a second? Vice Chairman Landsberg has seconded that. Discussion. Member Hamady.
The report talks a lot about the importance of Amtrak in developing their SMS and how far they've gone, and we reference the rulemaking that FRA has stayed now 7 times. The report also recommends that CSX implement an SMS program, which was actually mandated by Congress in 2008. So I wanted to just provide some further discussion and context of that legislative mandate and the requirement for FRA not to just issue a rulemaking for passenger railroads, but also to issue the requirement for Class 1 freight railroads.
Staff.
Staff supports the proposed amendment.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Okay, it's been moved and seconded to adopt Member Hamidi's motion to add additional language to page 156. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor of adopting that language, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed, there are none. The motion carries unanimously. I'd like to offer a motion. And my motion is on page 270, lines 2 through 4, amend the sentence beginning with moreover to read as follows. And I'll just read how it should be, how I propose it be read. However, and we're talking about the conductor here, however, he was performing repetitive physical labor outside in the cold, and he said that he had gotten into a work rhythm. And I'm going to propose that we strike the language, thus the preponderance of the evidence suggests that fatigue was not a factor in the accident, and insert, because of the presence of evidence mitigating both for and against the presence of fatigue, it could not be determined whether fatigue contributed to the circumstances of the accident. There's my motion. Is there a second? It's been seconded. For discussion, what I really worry about is that we sort of slam the door on fatigue. We say, thus the preponderance of the evidence suggests that fatigue was not a factor in the accident. It's hard to prove a negative. There are factors there that indicates he could have been fatigued. He had been conducting switching operations for 6 hours. It says he had been conducting physical labor. We heard earlier that he had switched over 30 switches, which does a manually operated switch. Hand throw switch requires some physical exertion. I think I mentioned it's cold. He got hot, so he took his jacket off, and then it got cold. This happened pretty close to the window of circadian low, which we think of as being somewhere around 2 to 6 in the morning, and his last, they tied up the train at, I think, 1:51. So it was pretty close to the window of circadian low. So those are some factors that could have indicated that fatigue was present. Mitigating factors could be that he had a consistent work schedule. He pretty much recently had been working this shift that begins at 3 in the afternoon. By the way, back to the idea of fatigue, he'd been on duty for almost 12 hours. Back to the mitigating factors, he did state that he felt alert, and he said that he had gotten into a work routine, which could have been more that this was like a skill-based thing, that he was just sort of working on, just things were flowing and he was in that routine. So I don't think we can say one way or the other that fatigue was a factor. I'm not at all trying to say fatigue was. All I'm really trying to say is we can't say for sure. And that's why I really didn't like the wording that says, thus the preponderance of evidence suggests that fatigue was not a factor. He could have been fatigued. He could not have been fatigued. So that's why I wanted to say thus because the presence of evidence mitigating both for and against the presence of fatigue, it could not be determined whether fatigue contributed to the circumstances of the accident. So that's my discussion. Vice Chairman Landsberg, comments? Member Hamady? Staff, Mr. Hall.
Staff supports the proposed amendment.
Thank you. All in favor of adopting the amendment? Please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The amendment has passed unanimously. Do we have a motion now to adopt the report as revised? It's been moved by Vice Chairman Landsberg, seconded by Member Hamady. All in favor, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The report has been adopted unanimously as revised. Do any of my colleagues on the board wish to have any further discussion about anything else related to this matter? Thanks. I mean, you want to do it?
Not now.
Okay, because we're about to.
Written comments. Written comments.
Oh, okay, yeah, and that's what I was going to ask. Do any board members wish the right to file a concurring or dissenting statement? Vice Chairman Landsberg? Thank you. Okay. Well, in closing, thank you to the investigative staff. I was there with you for a few days, had to come back for a board meeting, but it's always I don't like the circumstances in which you work, but it's always, it's fascinating to watch you do your work because you are true professionals. And you make me proud. You make us all proud. So I want to thank you for the hard work. I want to thank my colleagues for your preparation going into this meeting. What the public doesn't see is a lot of work that goes preparing for these meetings. I really thank you for the great debate and the great discussion. I think it's important that we be able to express our opinions and disagree on occasions, but I appreciate the collegiality of trying to find something that we can agree on. Dick Hibskin, I want to thank you for being the investigator in charge, but as I've always said, nothing around here gets done just by one person. It takes an entire team of people here at the table, but it also takes a lot of people behind the scenes, people you never see, including Deidre up there in the audio booth that makes the magic work on the cameras. It does take a team effort from the support and the program staff, so thank you to all of them. You know, here's a case where we reiterated more recommendations that we issued today. And this should not happen. What this really means is that recommendations that we've previously issued were not acted upon, so we had to reiterate them. But that said, today's new, reiterated, and reclassified recommendations, if acted upon, will make railroad transportation safer for passengers and train crews. Those recommendations that are urgent address imminent threats to safety, imminent threats to life and safety on our railroads. And unfortunately, in the wake of this tragic collision at Cayce, the FRA did not act on our urgent recommendation regarding signal suspension. And we had no choice but to close it today in an unacceptable fashion. Our recommendations will require action by several parties, including the regulator. It's time for the railroads to eliminate the possibility of employees failing to perform critical tasks, such as lining a switch, lining a derail, or ensuring cars are in the clear. It's past time for the FRA to act on Part 270, the System Safety Program. If the regulator will not act, though, the individual railroads can do what Amtrak has done, and that is they can create their own plan. So thank you for that. Finally, I've thought about this all along. I don't think it's lost on many the tragic irony of this mishap. Positive train control is designed to prevent accidents involving switches being left in the wrong position. And ironically, This accident occurred while the signals were being upgraded to accommodate positive train control. But in the end, PTC will save lives and prevent accidents like this. But whenever the railroads temporarily take protections offline, they must assess and mitigate the risk. And unfortunately, that did not happen here. We stand adjourned.